something that I've also done, you know, in terms of, this is something that I think everyone needs to know about. We've had a conversation about the food that we eat and obesity for, 10, 15, 20 years now, and it hasn't changed things. We have a massive obesity crisis. In the US, for example, 60% of children that are alive today in the US will be clinically obese by the time they're 35. Now that's going to shorten our lifespan, impose a huge burden on the health system, and mean that their children also carry that risk for a shortened lifespan. Because the conversation has been about obesity, and we know that when people are overweight or obese, it's very, very difficult to reverse that. And so people try and lose weight, they can't, or they can't keep it off, and so they give up and they go, well, might as well just keep eating the burgers. Because they don't understand that it's not about the body weight, it's about the nutrient density, it's about the quality of the food that they eat and the impact that has on their whole system. The other thing is that people, particularly younger people, pay far less attention to something that might happen off in the future. You know, one day you might have a heart attack or get diabetes or cancer if you keep eating this way. And then it doesn't cut through. In Australia, 40%, the average calorie intake of young people in Australia, children and adolescents, 40% of that is coming from ultra-processed food products. That's because it doesn't ring for them that it's going to have an impact on their health. But if you start talking about their brain health, their ability to learn and remember, and very importantly, their mental health, then that cuts through. So for me, this information, this knowledge is really essential to get out globally. And in a way, I've built not a for-profit business, but a similar type of an entity to Carmen's in terms of nutritional psychiatry, and had an impact globally on people's knowledge and understanding about the link between diet and mental and brain health, using strategic approaches in terms of, you know, making those links with the media, writing press releases, building societies, building collaborations, sharing knowledge wherever I can, doing it in a way that is accessible for everybody and not just for scientists. Yesterday I published my first book, which I'm really proud about. It's called Brain Changer. It'll be in the shops probably in the next few days, published by Pan Macmillan Press. And we're hoping to have publishing deals in the UK and the US as well, which means that people will be able to get a physical copy, and happily, it's just at the right time, I think. The zeitgeist and the amount of evidence, the consistency of the evidence is such that everyone is now finally paying attention to this, which I'm so happy about. So I'm going to share some of that knowledge with you today. I'm going to give you, you know, pretty much an overview. It's not going to be an in-depth dive, but I'm very happy, of course, to answer any questions about it. I'm going to talk to you about the Food and Mood Centre, because I set that up at the end of 2016 when I just finished having surgery for breast cancer, major surgery, and it was just me and 2 PhD students. But I wanted to create an entity that was a vehicle for evidence-based information for the general public, because people would say to me, how do I find out about this? And you can't send people detailed scientific papers. So we set up the Food and Mood Centre website, and from that, being an entity, we're able to leverage a lot of philanthropic funding. It's very hard to get funding for medical research in Australia. It's even harder to get funding for medical research in mental health. And when you're at the edge of a particularly cutting-edge field, like nutrition or gut microbiome research, it's almost impossible. So I've managed to develop networks that support me through philanthropy, which has been very, very important. And that in turn has allowed me to do research now that will inform large-scale competitive grant applications to something like the National Health and Medical Research Council. But my team has gone from me and 2 PhD students to about 22 within 18 months, which has been a huge growth, and we have more than 20 studies currently underway. The first data from the Food and Mood Centre will be published this year, which is incredibly exciting. But it really is just the start. I mean, what we're going to be doing over the next 20 years is far greater. One of the things we would love to do is to develop a clinic and actually develop a new model of clinical care for people with mental disorders. So by the end of this presentation, I think you'll see and understand why I think that's important. But needless to say, we think that dietitians are very important in this whole story and in translating this knowledge into improved health for the population. So for those of you who are dietitians, and I'm guessing most of you are, and the fact that there's only 2 dudes in the whole room tells me that you are a bunch of dietitians. We have 1 dude in our team as well, because dietetics, there's no dudes, and in psychology, there's a few dudes, but not many. So, dietitians are going to be very important to this, the translation of this. So I will start by putting things into a context which I'm sure many of you know, but just to ram it home. These are data from the largest study in the world. It's called the Global Burden of Disease Study. It's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It includes data from more than 180 countries, involves more than 1,800 researchers, where they look at disease, the burden of illness. It means how many people die from this, how much it costs, how many people are affected in terms of disability, but what are the drivers of disease? And from this we know that now the leading cause of early death in men and the second leading cause in women across the world is poor diet. Now this is of course very much a function of big food that worked out as early as the late 1800s that if you took, and this is ironic actually giving this talk here because this is, the Carmen's product is the opposite really of what was originally developed. But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, breakfast cereals with high levels of added sugars and fats and very processed started to make their way onto the shelves. And companies, businesses started to understand that you could make these food products very cheaply, you could market them very heavily, you could distribute them widely, and they had a long shelf life. So things like highly processed breads, tinned meats, tinned fruit with lots of added sugar, all the sorts of foods, the dried noodles, the powdered eggs, all of these things started to make their way onto the shelves, and then of course joined by sugar-sweetened beverages and all of the other sorts of processed foods that we see, chips, other sorts of unhealthy packaged snacks, and then of course, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried, and all of the rest of the fast food restaurants. And as a result, the global food landscape has changed so much. In the US, it's unrecognisable. There are at least 2 generations of people in the US who don't even recognise that their food environment is unusual or abnormal. In the US, about 60% of average intake is coming from ultra-processed food products. And this has had a massive impact on the world's population, reflected in these statistics. The WHO said by 2030, it's going to cost the global community at least $30 trillion, the impact of food-related disease on health, and that it's a global emergency and only the heads of state can intervene by restricting the marketing and the availability of these ultra-processed food products. And at this point, that's not happening. I mean, there's a few taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, but they're a tiny drop in the ocean compared to what we really need to be changing. So that's the global context. When they talk about poor diet, what do they mean? They mean diets that are low in fruits and vegetables, whole grain cereals, nuts and seeds, fibre, omega-3 fatty acids, but also the monounsaturated fatty acids. This is how they define poor diet. So it's not enough of these good things, and then of course it's too many of the not so good things. So red meat, and that's it's a bit controversial, the red meat thing, and I'd put some qualifiers there, but a moderate amount of good quality grass-fed red meat, great. Too much, not great. Too much feedlot meat, not great. Processed meat, definitely a baddie. Added sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages, trans fats, sodiums, all of these sorts of foods that we know make up so much of diets in the West and increasingly in low and middle income countries. This is the problem. These are data, actually I've got to update these slides because these are from the 2016 ABS report, but less than 0.5% of adults are eating the recommended intake of vegetables and legumes, which are really key sources of fibre in Australia. But even more concerning, only less than 0.5% of children and adolescents are getting this. And this is reflected in the very low average fibre content of Australian diets, which is similar in other Western countries as well. And fibre is critical to the health of the gut, so we'll talk about that a bit more in a little while. As I said, nearly 60% of Americans' energy intake is derived from ultra-processed foods. In Australia, it's about 35%, but 40% in children and adolescents, and going up all the time. These foods are designed to interact with the reward systems in the brain, and they do that very successfully, and of course they then displace the foods that we know are important for health. But at the same time, and this is what is not considered when the costs of the food environment are calculated, is that mental disorders, mental and substance use disorders, account for the leading global burden of disability. So whilst they directly influence the risk for death, they impose a huge burden of disability in terms of people's inability to work, disruption to their health and education and community functioning, all of these types of things. And the very large section there, that's unipolar depression, and this is anxiety disorders. And depressive and anxiety disorders are called the common mental disorders for a very good reason. They're very, very common, highly disabling. And the fact that the two things are linked has enormous implications for both prevention and for treatment. Now, if you think about mental disorders and what we know about the risk factors for mental disorders, and in particular here I'm talking about depression and anxiety, the common mental disorders, there's many, many, many things that contribute to increased risk. The main thing in terms of probably as a proportion would be family history. So you know your genetics and your family history. But then things such as early life trauma, poverty and disadvantage, life stress. These are all risk factors for depression in particular. They're very difficult to change. You know, they really, social disadvantage, of course, and poverty are things that everybody recognises needs to be addressed, but they are quite difficult to change, and politicians tend to not like to try to change them too much. So we need things that are modifiable. We need targets that we can modify to reduce the risk for these disorders. And food, of course, is something that affects 100% of the population every day, and it is definitely modifiable. So the fact that we have identified a risk factor, and this goes along with physical activity, which is also really important in the risk for depression, is really important. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is nutritional psychiatry, which is this field of research that we've led really internationally, which is aimed to determine the best ways to modify diet in order to both prevent and treat mental disorders. So what do we know so far? So this was my PhD study. I was mad enough to say I would really like to look at the relationship of diet quality to mental disorders. And those around me thought I was quite bonkers or maybe a bit of a hippie or whatever. But at the time, and this was the early 2000s, there was a lot of information coming out of the US about the impact of diet on brain plasticity. We'd only just figured out that there's bits of the brain that actually grow new neurons all the time. One of the main ones is this part of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a seat of learning and memory. It's like the brain power bit of your brain. and it's also very important in mental health. And it's one of two regions in the brain where we were starting to understand you actually grew new neurons all the time, and that was actually part of how it worked. And the proteins that fed those new neurons and helped them to grow and protected the ones that were already there, from all the animal studies that were happening in the early 2000s, we saw that diet seemed to have a big impact on those proteins and also on the functioning of the hippocampus in relation to learning and memory. Exercise also has the same sorts of impacts. And also around that time, there was this new field called psychoneuroimmunology. And basically what that was saying is that the immune system is really important in the risk for mental disorders. So systemic inflammation is like a chronic low-grade activation of the immune system. And you get these inflammatory molecules circulating. We know that they're risk factors for heart disease, for obesity, for all sorts of other things, and they're in turn created by those conditions. But they are also risk factors for mental disorders, particularly depression. And so this new knowledge was giving rise to this understanding that we shouldn't be separating the mind and the body. We need to be thinking about ourselves as this one complex, highly integrated system. And because diet is so important in immune function and systemic inflammation, and as we've seen, also in brain plasticity, I thought that there was a very good reason that we should look at this in mental disorders. In the wider field of medicine, of course, we've known for a long time that diet was really important for the risk of chronic disease, physical disease. So this was my PhD, and happily it was published on the front cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry, which meant that it had a very big impact. It meant that a lot of people read it, a lot of psychiatrists read it. And basically what we found in that study was, as I had hypothesised, it was done in a group of just over 1,000 women across the age range, very representative of the Australian population. And we looked at their diets in great detail. We looked at their clinical depressive and anxiety disorders. We did proper psychiatric assessments. We took into account, of course, all the things that could explain both diet and mental disorders. So things such as education and income, but also things that might be relevant like body weight, other health behaviours, how much people exercise, those sorts of things. And independent of all of those, we saw very consistently that, sorry, just don't think I've got the graphs there, but it doesn't matter. The people who have higher intakes of what we called a traditional diet, and we called it that just because it was a bit like a traditional Anglo-Saxon meat and 3 veg. So it was fruits and vegetables, it was whole grain cereals, particularly oats, it was fish, those sorts of foods, and lean red meat, was associated with about a 35% reduced risk of having either a clinical depressive or an anxiety disorder. And at the same time, people who had higher scores on this Western diet, more junk and processed foods, they had an increased likelihood of having these disorders. Now, at about the same time, like really within a couple of months, there were 2 other key studies that were published showing things that were very similar, but with a longitudinal study design. That means that they took a whole bunch of people at the start, ruled out those who'd already had some depression or some evidence of depressive symptoms, and then followed them over time, looking at their diets at the start to see who developed depression. And in this study here in Britain, they saw almost identical to what we did, that people who had higher scores on the Western unhealthy dietary pattern were about 50 to 60% more likely to develop depression over about 5 years, whereas those higher on a whole foods dietary pattern were much less likely. And again, this was another study published in Archives of General Psychiatry. So these were published in the 3 leading journals of psychiatry research, so they had a big impact. And this was looking at about 10,000 university graduates, followed over time, and those who had higher level of adherence to a traditional Mediterranean style diet, which we know is a particularly healthful way of eating, were much less likely to develop clinical depression over that time frame. So those 3 studies really kick-started the whole field and had a very big impact. science and clinicians as well. There have now been so many studies around the world in many different countries, many different cultures, showing the same thing, that no matter how you measure it, higher scores on a healthy dietary pattern are associated with an approximate 30% risk reduction for depression. And this is a meta-analysis that we just published recently. A meta-analysis is considered the highest form of evidence, and this is from the observational study. So this is where you take data on people's diets, their mental health, all sorts of other factors, and you put them together. You don't intervene in any way. But from these, we can see that all different ways of measuring a healthier diet, so in this case a Mediterranean style diet, is associated with an approximate 30% reduction in the risk for depression. If you look at dietary inflammatory indices, which are ways of measuring the inflammatory potential of diet, they come up with about the same thing. If you look at the healthy eating index, it's the same. However, the DASH diet, any sorts of versions of a healthy diet, and this is really key. Yes, the Mediterranean diet is probably the ideal diet, the traditional Mediterranean diet, and it's certainly the one with the largest evidence base, but there are many sorts of healthful diets. You can have a traditional Norwegian diet, a traditional Japanese diet, a traditional British diet. What they have at their heart is a higher intake of whole foods and a lower intake of junk and processed foods. And they are consistently associated with a reduced risk for depression. So that's in adults. But what's really key is thinking with our prevention hats on about younger people, because half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14. So if you want to actually reduce the risk of people developing these conditions in the first place, you need to find things that can be modified. And here, the data around the relationship between diet quality and mental health in children and adolescents is incredibly important. So this was the first study, and we led this. This was done with Murdoch Children's Research Institute, where we looked at data from about 7,000 children from around Australia. And here we see, again, that both the lowest intake of healthful foods and the highest intake of unhealthy foods are associated with a much greater likelihood of having high scores on a depression assessment. Now, this is a really key point. These are not just the opposite of each other. A lot of young people will be getting healthy food at home, but then before, during and after school, they're getting junk food at the local shop, even terribly from the canteen, what have you. And in this study, we were able to take into account a lot of things that could potentially be very important in this relationship. So things such as family conflict and poor family management and adolescent dieting behaviours didn't explain this very clear relationship that we saw. And we have gone on to do many, many other studies in adolescents showing the same thing, so this is a really important understanding. But if we go right back to the very start of life, so we think about parents and we think about parents' health. So we've known for a while that the metabolic health of parents, particularly even before pregnancy, is critical to child health outcomes, including their cognitive health, including their brain development, their risk for autism spectrum disorder, these sorts of things. And in fact, really amazing data show that for men, there's a very direct linear relationship between men's overweight and obesity and the risk of their children having autism spectrum disorder. But we written the first study to actually look at the relationship between mothers' diets during pregnancy and children's diets in the first few years of life and children's emotional health, markers of vulnerability to mental health problems. We did this in more than 23,000 mothers and their children, a very large Norwegian study, and we looked at mothers' diets in relation again to their dietary patterns. So every mother got a score on a healthy dietary pattern and an unhealthy dietary pattern. And then we looked at the trajectory of children's, what we call internalising and externalising. These are like behavioural markers of vulnerability to mental health problems. Things like tantrums and anger, but nightmares, crying, anxiety, these sorts of markers. And then we took into account all these really important things, including mothers' mental health, which we know is a strong predictor of children's mental health. So even taking all of these into account, since then this has been replicated extensively. Certainly in the animal studies you see that there's a very direct impact of maternal diet on children's brain outcome, of offspring brain outcomes, so that's in rodents and non-human primates. This is a meta-analysis that brings it all together, showing that what mum eats during pregnancy is clearly related to their emotional health, but also cognitive outcomes. So this is relevant to ADHD, autism, general intelligence, all of these types of things. So when we're thinking about the next generation, it's critical that we're getting this right. Think again about what I said at the start, about 60% of children today in the US will be obese by the time they're 35. And we know that this has a big impact on the health of their children, a direct impact. So we have to be getting it right for the next generation. This is another really important study. We had many studies, as I mentioned, in animals showing that you, through diet, could manipulate levels of proteins in the brain that were important for the hippocampus and what we call brain plasticity and its function. But we led the first study in humans to show that this was also the case. Here we looked at the size of the hippocampus in about 250 older adults. Now, taking into account a whole host of things that could have had an influence on that, we saw that there was a very clear gradient between the quality of their diets and the size of their hippocampus. In this study, the blue bars were the first assessment and the red bars were 4 years later. Now, what you're seeing there is that very depressing age-related decline in the size of the hippocampus. As you get older, you start to forget where you put your keys and all those sorts of things. And this is related to this shrinkage of this key part of your brain that has such a big bearing on your ability to learn and remember things. But here we see that the quality of people's diets is very clearly related to the size of their hippocampus. Poor diet versus those with a good diet. And this wasn't just a trivial effect, this was a very large effect size. The dietary relationship was about the equivalent of about 60% of that age-related decline in the size of the hippocampus. Now again, this has been replicated in other studies. So this gave rise to some very interesting and slightly amusing headlines around the world, but I kind of like that because it really did cut through. Apparently kids were coming home and saying to their parents, "Mum, don't buy that, junk food shrinks your brain." And if you want to think about it very simply, that is a key message that you can get across. As I said, there's been more studies that have shown this. This one was published last year in more than 4,000 people. Better overall diet quality is related to larger total brain volume, grey matter, white matter, and hippocampal volume. So we've known for ages that things that are related to diet, such as body weight, high blood pressure, blood cholesterol, blood glucose, they're all related to the risk for dementia, cognitive decline. But the new data say it's actually, let's just talk about diet directly. Diet matters to your risk for dementia and cognitive decline. If you want to keep your brain healthy, you pay attention to what you stick in your mouth. So the state of the evidence in 2017, we had very consistent observational data across countries and cultures and of course age groups. They fulfilled what we call the Bradford-Hill criteria for causality. But remember, correlation doesn't equal causation. Without experiments, you can't say that one thing causes another. This is why animal experiments are important. The associations that we saw between diet quality and mental health were largely independent of things such as SES, education, body weight, other health behaviours, not apparently explained by reverse causality. So of course people do eat differently when they're having a major depression episode, but that doesn't explain the long-term associations that we see. Very extensive data from animal studies But there was an obvious need for interventions, for randomised controlled trials to say, if we change diet, does it change depression in people? So that's what we set out to do. And we went where angels fear to tread. So this is the SMILES trial, which has had a very large impact around the world. I mean, it would be a very rare month where it's not featured in one of the major newspapers or magazines internationally, because it was the first randomised control trial that aimed to assess the impact of dietary improvement on clinical depression. So what we did in this study was to look at the efficacy and the cost effectiveness of dietary improvement in the treatment of major depression, delivered with dietitians. People with major depressive disorder were randomly assigned to receive either dietary support from a clinical dietitian or social support, which we already know is helpful for people with depression. And they saw either an RA or a dietitian for 3 months. The ModiMed diet, now this is all available online. The citation is OPIE, O-P-I-E, et al. In Nutritional Neuroscience. That's not the publication with the primary results, but that's the protocol with all the details of the dietary information. The ModiMed tips: select fruit, vegetables and nuts as a snack. Include vegetables with every meal. Select whole grain breads and cereals. Eat legumes, salmon, lean red meat 3 to 4 times a week. Dairy, use olive oil as the main added fat. Sweets for special occasions only. Water as the optimal drink. These are the sorts of recommendations that were given, because you think people with major depression, they have often fatigue, they really have struggled to even get out of bed sometimes. So they're not going to go and do a Ottolenghi meal for themselves every night. We said, let's make it easy. Our aim is to just help you to swap out the sweets and the pies and the chips and what have you that you're eating now for whole grain cereals, for vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, etc. So here we have tin sardines with whole grain biscuits plus salad. Tin salmon with tin chickpeas and salad. I actually use this all the time. This is my fast food. Tin tuna plus instant brown or basmati rice. That's also another one of my favourite food. And, you know, with tin beans. So really simple. And it was remarkably effective. Not only did the people in the trial manage to make really genuine improvements to their diet, but it had a substantial impact on their clinical depression. So about 30% of the people in the dietary intervention actually achieved full clinical remission, compared to about 8% in the social support group. What we saw was a very clear correlation between the degree of dietary change and the degree of improvement in people's depressive symptoms. The more people changed their diet, the more they benefited. But really importantly, we did a very detailed cost analysis. Again, this was published, showing that the diet we were recommending was cheaper than the diet people were on when they first came into the study. So this is not about going out and buying organic this and, you know, fresh berries and fresh fish. It's saying you can use tin beans, you can use tin fish, you can use frozen vegetables. And it just needs to be accessible and feasible for people to achieve. Very importantly, we did a detailed economic evaluation. This is also published, and this is extraordinary. We showed that people who got the dietary support cost about $3,000 less than those who got the social support, because they saw health professionals less often, they lost less time out of role. Very important if you want to convince policymakers to change the way they're dealing with depression in clinical practice. Now, happily, our finding was replicated a few months later with our colleagues over in South Australia in the Healthy Med trial. They did their intervention in a group-based setting, and they had a larger sample size. Half the people went into a Mediterranean diet group where they got nutritional workshops and, you know, how to shop and that sort of thing. Fortnightly food hampers, shopping and budgeting activities, etc. The social support group, which was also very popular, they went and had, went to the movies and played games and watched movies, and everybody had a fun time. So both groups were very popular. As you see in depression trials, both groups improved, but the scores in the Mediterranean diet group improved a lot more than those in the social support group. And again, there was a very strong link between the amount they changed their diet and the amount their depression improved. And it was also highly cost effective, same as ours. So this is very important. Now we've just published this. This is a meta-analysis, and I think that this is a game changer because again, if you want to change clinical practice, you need evidence at the meta-analytic level. So bringing together all of the studies that have looked at changing diet and have happened to measure changes in depression as an outcome, keeping in mind that there's only been 2 studies, ours and Healthy Med, that have actually directly tested this in a depressed population. But in the wider population, in people with other conditions, metabolic conditions, PTSD, etc., we see that there is a very clear impact of dietary change on symptoms of depression. It's amazing. We've had no new treatments for depression for decades. It is consistently one of the top 5, if not the leading cause of disability globally, across the world, countries everywhere. And this is saying that dietitians, and this is a key point with this, you get much better outcomes if you use a dietitian than if you just use a research assistant. So dietitians are really important to this story. This is what we need to be doing in clinical practice. We need to be offering people in clinical practice a referral to see a dietitian, as well as the opportunity to have antidepressants, psychotherapy, but also to get support with their food intake. And we've made recommendations to the government and to the Shadow Mental Health Minister that we need to have a Medicare item for people with mental disorders to see dietitians. Now this is also incredibly important for people with psychosis, because we know that people with psychosis, they have dysregulated glucose metabolism anyway that predisposes them to weight gain and metabolic disorder, but the medications that they're on have a big impact and they put on a huge amount of weight, and it means that there's a 20-year life expectancy gap between those who have psychotic disorders and the general public. And colleagues of ours up in Sydney at the Bondi Clinic have shown convincingly that if people get dietetic support as well as exercise physiology support, you can mitigate nearly all of that impact on their metabolic health. So we need to make it easy, accessible, feasible, inexpensive for people to go and see a dietitian to get support to change their diet. So the take-home message is that diet really matters to mental and brain health. It's modifiable, therefore it's a really important target for prevention and treatment. We've had a big impact with getting this message across. This is a commentary we did in Lancet Psychiatry in 2015. It's had more than 200 citations, which is a marker of how much impact it's had. What we're doing next, of course, we're doing a lot of research to understand the pathways by which diet exerts its impact on mental health. And the gut is a key one. So I talked about the immune system, I talked about brain plasticity, but actually the gut and the microbiota that live in the gut, we now understand play a key role in both of those things, as well as gene activity, as well as metabolism, all of these aspects of our physiology that inform our risk for mental disorder. And of course we know that based on current evidence, the most important thing that affects the health of the gut and the composition of the bacteria that live in the gut is our diet. And you can change that within days by changing diet. So it's a really key target, and it's also called to measure because it's incredibly complex, but at least it's not that hard getting a stool sample. Not very fun, but I would say more fun than having a blood sample. So the gut microbiota, we have over 100 trillion microbes that live in us and on us. At least half of our cells are microbial, and 99.5% of our genetic material is actually microbial. So in many ways, we're more fun than we are human. They have a very important role in metabolism and body weight, immune system functioning, mood and behaviour. I won't go into huge details. Can I just check, how long do I have?
You've still got another 40 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's great. Okay, so we eat Obviously, we mush up our food in our mouth, it goes down into our stomach, it gets mushed up more, goes down into the small intestine, which is actually not very small at all, where simple sugars and fats and things are actually absorbed into the bloodstream. You guys probably know more about this than I do as dietitians, but it's really the large bowel where we have a lot of interest, and that's mainly because it's easy to study. It's very difficult to study what's going on in the small intestine, but the large bowel, you just get a stool sample. But what we eat, of course, has a very important impact on the gastrointestinal tract. Now, we've known about the gut-brain axis forever. We know that the gut and the brain talk to each other via the vagus nerve. There's the gut has its own nervous system, the enteric nervous system, that's completely separate from the brain. It's called our second brain for that reason. And the gut and the brain talk to each other all the time, but most of the communication goes from the gut to the brain. About 10% goes from the brain to the gut. But what we haven't known until recently, because we didn't have the gene sequencing technology to know how to measure it, was the importance of the bacteria that live in the gut. So here we've got a bit of an overview. There are many nice reviews on this. But basically, the cells in the gut produce large quantities of neurotransmitters. We're not quite sure how they interact with the brain because they may not quite cross the blood-brain barrier, but the bacteria certainly determine how much serotonin is produced in the brain because they affect tryptophan metabolism. Very importantly, when we eat fibre is fermented by the gut bacteria, and that fermentation process produces what we call metabolites such as short-chain fatty acids and long-chain fatty acids. Those metabolites play a very important role in influencing our immune system, our body weight, our glucose regulation, and the health of our brain. But without fibre, you don't get metabolites. So you need fibre, and it looks like you need fibre from lots of different sources. These people on ketogenic diets, and they say, oh, I get heaps of fibre from my non-starchy green vegetables. Well, actually, no, you don't. And you certainly don't get enough of the different types of fibre. You need the different types of whole grain cereals. You need legumes, chickpeas, lentils, etc. You need starchy vegetables. You need a highly diverse range of plant foods for optimal gut health. And just having a bit of spinach is not going to do it for you. And of course, in the West, we don't eat anywhere near enough fibre. And as dietitians, you would know that. The bare minimum is about 30 grams a day. But, you know, in hunter-gatherer populations and other parts of the world, both in the past and now, people could be having up to 100 grams a day of fibre because of the foods that they're consuming. We know that the microbiota, the bacteria that live in our gut, are really important to brain health. How do we know this? Well, one of the first bits of evidence is that if you breed rats or mice without any bacteria, poor little things are sort of bred in a vacuum, they're called germ-free mice, and they have an altered stress response, altered brain plasticity, altered levels of neurotransmitters, very altered behaviours, altered immune system, altered blood-brain barrier. So we know from these data and others that the early life gut microbiota, so the gut microbiota of infants, is really critical to their brain development. It's also really critical to the development of our immune system. If you take animals, rodents, and stress them out, you can mitigate the impact on the stress response by giving probiotic bacteria. But if you cut the vagus nerve, that effect is lost. So we know that the bacteria do something and they do it via the vagus nerve. I'm not exactly sure how. It's extremely complex. This is really important though. I think this is one of the most important bits of evidence because it speaks to causality. If you take germ-free mice and you transplant them with stool from someone with depression, you will induce a depressed phenotype in the mouse. You will induce behaviours that we regard as markers of depression in the mouse. And that doesn't happen if you do store from a healthy person without depression. Now, they've shown this several times. About 3 weeks ago, a very important study came out where they did the same with patients with schizophrenia. They induced a schizophrenia-type behaviour in the animals that received the poo from people with schizophrenia, and it also changed the neurotransmitters in the recipient animal, and they were the neurotransmitters that we know are involved in schizophrenia. And we see this in Parkinson's disease, we see it even in... You take stool from someone with hypertension, you can actually induce hypertension in the animal recipient. It's extraordinary, because it's saying whatever's going on in there, it's actually having a causal impact on our physiology. As I've just said, fecal transplants from people with high blood pressure, this is a model that is being used quite frequently now, and it's a very cool way of doing experiments. So microbiota have a big impact on body weight and metabolism. As some examples, microbiota from obese adult humans to mice can transmit obesity. Microbes from the guts of malnourished children given to mice can cause weight reduction and malnutrition even when they're having enough food. So we're doing a lot of research now looking at the gut microbiota in people with eating disorders and how it might be related to their psychiatric symptomatology, their prognosis, but also what the impact of the refeeding paradigms in clinical eating disorder clinics, what that's doing to the gut microbiota and whether they're optimal for gut health. This is a really cool study. This is one of the few, so randomised controlled trials, it takes a long time to get the funding for them, they're incredibly expensive, they take a very long time to run, and this is why we don't have too many trials just yet of probiotics. But in this one, they took patients that had been hospitalised with mania, so they had quite serious bipolar 1 disorder, and they randomly assigned them to get either probiotics or placebo, and then they looked at what happened and who went back into hospital. And the ones who got the placebo had a far greater likelihood of being readmitted to hospital with mania and in a much shorter time frame than those who got the probiotic. So this is a really important study because it suggests that even in a really severe psychiatric disorder, we may be able to think about probiotics for treatment. Another thing that is a subject of a lot of interest is intestinal permeability, or what some colloquially call leaky gut. But basically we have a lovely thick layer of mucus on our intestinal lining, or we should have, and that's a very important mucosal layer that has all sorts of properties. But things that strip that mucosal layer can result in what we call leaky gut, and it means that the intestinal epithelium, these tight junctions open up and the contents of the gut can leak into our bloodstream. And what happens then is, of course, the body mounts an immune response and you get this systemic inflammation. Now, lots of things can cause a diminution of the quality or the amount of mucus and the lining of the gut. One of those things is stress. Another is not enough fibre. The bacteria start eating the mucus because they don't have fibre to eat. But we see that in mental disorders, in depression, there's evidence of this leaky gut. You see more antibodies to bacteria in the bloodstream of people with clinical depression than those without. So keeping the health of the gut lining is important for depression, as it is for every other aspect of our health. The main factors that influence the microbiota, our age. Certainly in infancy, the first few days, weeks, months of life seem to be critical to so many aspects of setting up our bodily systems over the lifespan, including our brain and our immune system. By about the age of 3, people are starting to get their own sort of fingerprint, their own microbial composition that follows them then through life. Geography, where people live, because of their diet, but exposure to farm animals, soil, etc. has a big impact on people's microbial composition. Stress, infection and medication use, of course, antibiotics right the way through the food system, big impact on the microbiome. But as I said, diet is, at this stage, we understand it to be the most important factor affecting the gut microbiome. In this particular study, explain nearly 60% of the variation in gut microbiota, whereas genes accounting for no more than 12%. So what we eat is more important than our genetic background. Plant-based diets, lots of fibre, lots of diversity, increased microbial diversity, which we understand is associated with good health outcomes. It's one of the single most important markers we have of healthy guts or otherwise. But also the production, of course, of these short-chain fatty acids that interact with every gene in our body and run our immune system and affect our metabolism and our brain, etc. Carbohydrate and fibre intake are key, and the Western diet seems to be particularly detrimental to the gut microbiome. High fat intake consistently shown to be problematic, although we're still getting at what types of fat might be important. Saturated fat does seem to drive bacteria that are associated with inflammatory diseases such as Bolophila, whereas mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids seem to be helpful. Refined soybean oil and the sorts of seed oils that are used a lot in highly processed foods seem to be problematic as well. In this study, just as one example, for people over only 5 days, half of them were put on a plant-based diet with lots of whole grains, legumes, fruits and vegetables, or an animal-based diet with meat, eggs and cheeses. And over 5 days, they saw a big impact on these sorts of short-chain fatty acids, which we know, again, are really important for all sorts of health processes in the body. So that's just saying you can change your gut microbiota very, very quickly. This is a really important study. We see over and over again that the gut microbiota composition of those living more traditional lifestyles with traditional diets is much more diverse and has many more markers of health than those in the West. So in this study, they looked at the gut microbiome of people, African Americans, compared to rural Africans in South Africa. And they saw, of course, that in the Western diet, animal proteins and fats were 2 to 3 times higher, whereas carbohydrate and fibre was far higher in the African diet. And there was very big differences in the gut microbiota composition, but also in these markers of inflammation in the bowel that are very clearly linked to cancer risk. Much higher levels in the African Americans than in the rural South Africans. But then what they did was they swapped their diets for 2 weeks. So the poor South Africans got an African American diet, they got a Western diet, and the African Americans got a traditional diet with lots of fibre, plant foods, etc., etc. And within 2 weeks, it had a profound impact on the composition of the microbiome and the inflammatory markers linked to bowel cancer risk. So again, it's saying we can change our microbiome and our health status very quickly by changing our diet. This is a nice a systematic literature review by Singh et al. In Translational Medicine in 2017. This is quite a useful citation if you just want to get across what we know so far, although it's 2017, so it's likely to be updated soon. Bifidobacterium and lactobacillus are often sort of considered the key microbiota that are associated with health, and plant proteins increase those, and they seem to improve the gut barrier. They increase the levels of short-chain fatty acids, which also help to protect the gut barrier, and they reduce inflammation. Animal protein seems to do the opposite. You get reductions in bifidose that increases in things such as Bolophila, which is associated with inflammatory diseases, and reductions in the short-chain fatty acids, and these are associated with IBD and cardiovascular disease risk. Similarly, the dietary fats seem to matter. So saturated fats seem to increase Bolophila and negative, bacteria that are associated with negative health outcomes, although, again, this is a new area of research, so we still need a lot more information to be absolutely sure about this. But from what we see so far, the saturated fat seems to increase inflammation. We think about the reduced fibre in our diets, but also the impact of the overuse of antibiotics and processed foods. We have reduced massively the diversity of the microbiome in modern westernised diets. This is hunter-gatherers, and then and moving on to agriculture, we're eating less and less diverse foods, industrial foods, and now we've got the ultra-processed foods since the 1980s. Accompanied by fundamental shifts in microbiome composition, reduced diversity, we're losing key species that may actually be really important for our long-term survival as humans. What we see in animal studies is that after 4 generations of a low-fibre diet, a whole lot of bacteria are extinct and they cannot be got back again without a fecal transplant. Now, if you think about a Western diet and how normal this is, and then there's at least 2 generations in the US that will be very, very low fibre intake generally, this is really critical to potentially long-term health, but also these changes have correlated with massive increase in the incidence of allergic disease such as asthma, eczema, hay fever, etc. And also autism spectrum disorder, which we think the early life gut microbiome, the first year of life, might play a role in. So again, getting fibre and plant food diversity back into our diets is really important. Other aspects of Western diets that are problematic, artificial sweeteners seem to induce glucose intolerance by altering the gut microbiota, and there's more and more data here. Now, at this point, they're coming from animal studies, so we need them from humans, but it's still the case that the artificial sweeteners seem to affect the gut microbiome in a way that may predispose to weight gain, which is, of course, very ironic. But also dietary emulsifiers, particularly things like ice cream, which have a lot of them. From many studies now in animals, we see that the emulsifiers seem to strip the gut lining. And so that mucosal layer, they act like detergent. And we don't know about things such as soy lecithin, which is often used. That hasn't been examined. This is more the sorts of emulsifiers that you get in the ultra-processed food products. This is really very interesting data too, and again, there's been a number of studies now showing if you take 2 groups of animals, rats or mice, and you put one group just on its normal ratty, mousy diet, and another group on a high-fat diet, the high-fat diet, of course, will induce a lot of weight gain in the animal over time. But if you give a third group that same high-fat diet, but also add polyphenols, which you get, of course, from plant foods. I don't need to explain to you guys what polyphenols are. It seems to mitigate, to some extent at least, weight gain. Now, this has been shown in more than one study. It seems that you may be able to mitigate weight gain by having foods that are high in polyphenols, which makes sense. And it seems to be working through the gut microbiota. Fermented foods are something we're really, really interested in because people have, I think, not really understood about fermented foods and what their perceived value is. Fermented foods are not necessarily valuable because they have lots of live bacteria in them. In fact, in many fermented foods, there won't be a whole host of live bacteria because they will have eaten the substrate and done their fermentation and then died because there's no more food left. But fermented foods, which of course are a very important part of traditional diets around the world, they have the prebiotics that the bacteria have been using. They have some live bacteria, but often a lot of dead bacteria, which people, what is not recognised is that dead bacteria also have very potent bioactive properties because of the cell wall interacts with the immune system. But thirdly, what they have is something called biogenics. And these are the metabolites. This is what's produced when the bacteria ferment the substrates. This includes vitamins, peptides, bacteriocins, and immunopotentiators, and even neurotransmitters, as well as these all-important short-chain fatty acids. So, for example, fermented foods can produce GABA, which is a really important neurotransmitter in the body. So there's many, many different metabolites that are produced during the fermentation process that we think may have health properties. But there's been very, very little research done to look at that in detail. And partly it's because it's so complex. There are so many metabolites that trying to figure out what's doing what is very, very hard. But we do know that fermented foods influence the gut microbiome composition and function. They alter the breakdown and absorption of macronutrients. They stimulate immune cells in the gut. They have direct anti-inflammatory effects. They influence the mucosal lining and gut barrier health. They increase lactobacillus and bifidobacteria and decrease Phelophila. So they increase the good ones, decrease the bad ones. There seems to be evidence that they can alleviate gastrointestinal intolerance symptoms, increase intestinal transit time, a whole host of things that we think are going to be a benefit, and we're really interested to do more research with fermented foods because I think that they're potentially going to be really useful. There's some limited evidence in humans. A 4-week intake of fermented foods versus a non-fermented milk by healthy women affected effective parts of the brain under brain scans. Fermented ginseng versus placebo in 93 non-depressed postmenopausal women improved cognition and depressive symptoms. So there's just, there's a few small studies, but we need to do more studies. This one's negative. This RCT didn't have any impact on depressive or anxiety symptoms. There's a lot of understanding now that everyone's microbiome profile is very different, so we may need to tailor our probiotic intake to our own systems. For me personally, I suspect that kefir is a particularly good form of fermented food. It seems to be, particularly dairy kefir, something that the bacteria are able to live in and get through into the gut, survive the stomach, etc. And of course you can make your own kefir, and it's really cheap and easy and yummy. So very briefly, good for guts, plant foods, polyphenols, olive oil, omega-3 fatty acids and fermented foods. Legumes, whole grain cereals of all different sorts, lots and lots of plants, nuts, dark chocolate, yay, olive oil, all the good things, yogurt and fermented, other sorts of fermented foods, nice, good quality cheese. Bad for guts. Based on what we know so far, again, we need a lot more research and we need more research in humans, but saturated fats, processed foods, added sugars, refined carbohydrates, binge drinking, and stress. And there's some pictures of sorts of foods that you don't want to be eating, like Fruit Loops, and bacon, and chippies. So the take-home message again, diet matters to mental and brain health. It seems to operate at least partly by the gut microbiota and its influence on the immune system and the brain. Fibre and polyphenols seem to be critical to gut health. Processed foods and high-fat diets are toxic to gut health. Again, diet is modifiable. We need to be targeting it for prevention and treatment of mental disorders. And a Western diet should be considered the most noxious and important environmental toxicant based on the data around the globe. So, this is not food. And this is food. And I know you guys know the difference. We're doing a lot of research at the Food and Mood Centre. We've grown from just 3 of us to more than 20. We're doing more than 20 different projects. A lot of them are focused on the microbiome. This is one that will be the first cab off the rank in terms of our data, and we're really excited because we've seen that there is actually a difference between the two groups in our primary outcome. But basically, based on the understanding that only 10% of women meet the recommendations for pregnancy for vegetables during pregnancy, and only about 4% met the recommended 8.5 serves of grain and whole grain cereal foods, and overall less than 10% met the dietary guidelines, dietary intakes during pregnancy can really be improved. And because we're now understanding that what the mum eats may have a big bearing on the microbiota of the infant, understanding again that the infant microbiome seems to be really important for brain development and the development of their immune system and their risk for allergic disease, asthma, etc. We did a randomised control trial. So we recruited pregnant women through the Royal Children's Hospital, and we randomly assigned them to get either a dietary support, like a workshop, a half-day workshop that just focused on the gut. Said how to increase fibre in your diet, how to include fermented foods in your diet, what you can eat, and then support for that. Compared to those women who didn't get that, they're supposed to get dietary advice from their obstetrician. who knows if they do or they don't. But the primary outcome that we were interested in was the gut microbiota profile of the infants a month after birth. What mum ate, is that going to have an impact on the babies, and are we going to be able to see a difference? Now, remarkably, given that we only had quite a small study, again, unfunded, we have seen a difference. We don't know what the difference is because we haven't unblinded it. We don't know what group is what, but the fact that there is a difference is quite astounding and very interesting. This is the study that is a randomised controlled trial that's underway at the moment. This is the mood study, and Robin is here from A2 Dairy. We're very, very interested in dairy and the possible impact of the dairy choices people make on their mood, their cognition and the health of their gut. For many reasons that I don't have time to go into, we think that there likely is a difference between dairy products that have the A1 protein and those that don't. So we're running a randomised control trial and the primary outcome is psychological distress in women. The secondary outcomes are symptoms of depression and anxiety, but also cognitive functioning, and we're also looking in great detail at the gut and markers in the blood of inflammation and gut function. The lovely thing about this trial is that there is no way of knowing who's getting what with the dairy because they taste exactly the same, they look exactly the same. So no one in the study, except for one research assistant who is sworn to secrecy, no one knows who's getting what. The statistician won't know, the people who are doing the assessments won't know. So that is underway at the moment. We'd be really grateful if you can push participants our way if you want to talk about this. We're aiming for 160 women, people who already drink milk. This is a really interesting study. We're doing a pilot study of the ketogenic diet for psychotic symptoms. So our version of the ketogenic diet optimises poly and monounsaturated fatty acids, so we're trying to make it as healthy as possible. You would know that in the US there are just hundreds of thousands of rabid people who are just absolutely certain that a ketogenic diet will solve climate change and everything known to man on the basis of virtually no evidence at all. Now, the ketogenic diet is certainly very useful for about half of people with treatment-resistant epilepsy, but it does have some problems that go with it. Of course, you guys as dietitians would know that. There is evidence from case studies and also from animal studies that suggest that it might also be useful in psychosis, because it obviously has a big impact on the brain. With the case studies in schizophrenia, we don't know whether it's the ketogenic diet itself or because people have removed potential allergens or other things from their diet. We need research, so that's what we're doing here. It's an inpatient unit in Finland where they actually already have the protocol for a ketogenic diet because they also treat young people with epilepsy, and they're locked up, they can't get out, there's no cafeteria, they will eat what they're provided with. Of course they have informed consent, we won't just be tying them up and treating them. But for those who elect to go into the study, half will get just their normal food and from the hospital, and the other half will go on to this ketogenic diet. And we want to see whether there's any hint that it has an impact on their functioning and their outcomes. So that, I think, is going to be a very important study. We're also doing a really detailed study very soon on the impact of a ketogenic diet, this same sort of healthy ketogenic diet, on the gut microbiome. So 10 of us from within the unit, because we want to make the baseline homogeneous, so we need to get people who already have like a Mediterranean style diet with lots of complex carbohydrates and whole grains, moving across to this ketogenic diet for 4 weeks and looking in great detail at the impact on the gut microbiome. Because based on everything we know, a high-fat diet and or a low-fibre diet, which is what a ketogenic diet is likely to be really toxic to the gut. But without data, we don't know. It may be that the gut microbiota adapt. We have to do the science to actually know. This is very cool. This is, we submitted the ethics, the protocol to ethics yesterday. And this, actually we're aiming for 60, and we've now got extra funding, so we're going to also be doing this in collaboration with Harvard University, where we'll do another 30 over there. And it is actually a trial of poo pills for major depression. So there's emerging evidence that fecal microbial transplants might actually help people with psychiatric disorders. And of course, getting a colonoscopy is very intrusive, it's expensive, etc. Some data from the US is suggesting that you can get the same sorts of benefits in C. difficile, for which it's a first-line treatment, by using crapsules rather than the colonoscopy version. So we're going to trial crapsules in people with major depressive disorder, as long as ethics say we can. But based on a very extensive evidence base, fecal transplants are safe. We will have a very, very intensively stringent screening process for the donor stool. But it could be, if it's efficacious, form a really interesting, cheap, accessible treatment for psychiatric disorders. So that's what we want to look at. As I said, I've got a big team now, more than 20. We're funded by Australian Rotary Health, who are just marvellous, National Health and Medical Research Council, the Wilson Foundation, who have just been incredible. They've given us over $1.5 million, and it's really supported a great deal of the work that we do. And the Fernwood Foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of Fernwood Gyms, Di, who set up Fernwood Gyms, who's absolutely a legend. She is helping us a lot as well. So, as I said, we have more than 20 different studies underway, and we're just zhuzhing our website now, so it's going to have a lot more information on it. I loved your idea of the Carmen's Kitchen and getting input from the public. I think that's such a brilliant idea, and actually we want to do that now. Get particularly people with mental disorders to have input. What do they want to know? What would be useful to them? And so thank you. That's another wonderful thing. So I am the president of the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research. I set that up in 2013. We ran our first major international conference in Washington in 2017. The next one is on October this year in London. It's looking to be a very, very well attended and very important and exciting event. So if people are research or just even interested, we're going to be running workshops. Come along to that. As I said, my book was published yesterday, Brain Changer, through Payment Press, so that's available online or through bookshops.